Today we're going to talk about enterprise reporting, specifically in ServiceNow, which is where we focus at VividCharts. And we're going to take a deep look into just how AI and the tools we have with AI are reshaping that. Just a little bit about VividCharts. VividCharts, again, like I said, we are focused on reporting, enterprise reporting. We typically think about a few things in that journey, and that's disjointed, misguided, and manual reporting efforts. So anywhere we see in the enterprise where we see reports that are misguided or not getting the value that are needed, we see disjointed processes or just manual efforts in order to get reports done, we see it as an opportunity. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that and how AI can help with that. I think I need to go back one. For those of you who don't know me, I should introduce myself. My name is Deach, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at VividCharts. All I think about is reporting in ServiceNow, and I'm going to share that with you today. So if I haven't met you before, I apologize about not introducing myself previously. I will say also as we go through this, I'm going to pause at different moments and different times in order to take questions. So please, there should be a Q&A segment in your window. Go ahead and put your questions in there, and I'll try to get to them if I can when appropriate. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. We're briefly going to just set some groundwork in for the discussion. We're going to talk about the state of AI and enterprise generally and just take a brief look at that. We're going to go through a little bit of opinions that we have here at VividCharts. One thing about AI is all of us, you're on this call to do discovery, but everyone's discovering how to utilize these tools in the enterprise. So there's a few things that VividCharts that we know to be true, or at least we believe to be true. And then there are some things that we believe will be true. So I'm going to go through a little bit of opinions held and discussion on that. Then we're going to go into a section I called Meet the Agents. Agentic AI, agents utilizing the different AI tools is all the topic and a lot of the things that are being talked about in the industry right now. So I'm going to go through a segment called Meet the Agents, and we're just going to introduce agents we're working on, characteristics of them, and such. But I do want to say the majority of this is walking through some use cases. I have some very specific problems that are brought to us quite frequently inside of enterprise reporting in ServiceNow, and we're going to walk through some of those use cases. So let's go ahead and move on. Now, just as a reflection, we're a month and a few weeks out of Knowledge 25. And if you were able to participate in Knowledge 25, you know that everything was around AI, and specifically, most of the discussions were around AI agents. And you all have joined this call, so I don't think I have to convince any of you that this is first and foremost in most of our discussions on how we're thinking about integrating it, how we're going to utilize it, where we're going to get the value, etc. But I did want to go into a little bit of details or some research that was done by Box back in earlier the first quarter. You can go and see this whole report, and I would actually encourage you to go see it. It's a well-done survey done by Box, and the URL's down there at the bottom. It's just box.com/state-of-AI. And what they did is they surveyed 1,300 global enterprise IT leaders. And this is some of the information they found. They found that 94% of these enterprises were already using AI. Now that's with varying levels of maturity. So maybe some are just using different chatbots, all the way to fully agentic workflows already being implemented. But 94% have some sort of integration and usage of AI, which I thought was interesting. 60% of those surveyed found that said that they expect over the next 2 years to have a transformation because of AI, which I thought was a pretty strong statement saying that transformation is happening within the next 24 months because of AI. And then 90% of those surveyed said that they expect AI budgets and spending to increase just next year, partly because I think most of us are trying to figure out how to utilize AI, where to utilize it. And in part of that, budgets are going to be allocated to some of these things that are being found. But if we're integrating AI, if we're in the planning process, if we're understanding these tools, what are the expectations that we want as an enterprise to get out of our AI spend? And here are the three top things that these industry leaders said. They want time savings. So they want to see work being done, but being done faster. Part of that is due to the employee productivity. So can we have tasks that employees do today manually, just like we said in the mission statement for VividCharts? Can we offload those to agents, or can we offload those to some sort of AI tool? So employee productivity was number two, and then cost reduction. It probably makes sense that with time savings and employee productivity, we can have some sort of cost reduction associated with these tools. So that's the state of AI in the industry, or just a brief look at it. Again, I think we all know that it's what's being talked about, so I don't feel like I need to convince any of you to think about it too much deeper. But what are some of the realities around these tools? I think, again, we have these things that I'm labeling as things that we know. This first box, I believe very strongly, and I think we believe at VividCharts very strongly, that AI is going to start unlocking the ability to get value out of our unstructured data. Now, at ServiceNow, when we're doing reporting, we're very lucky. We have a common database model that allows us to have great structure on our data. As we integrate more modules, many times we have very good structures in tables. And so we, at VividCharts, feel pretty lucky that we get a report on a lot of data that is very structured. However, just generally, I saw this report or this statistic not too long ago that 80 to 90% of all data in the enterprise is actually unstructured data. And you can think about that as like work notes, journal notes, maybe a project manager putting information into their project status. It's content and context for potential value, but it's really hard to not only report on, but to get value out of that. One thing that is true, and we believe pretty strongly, is that these AI tools are going to allow us to extract value. And we have several examples of that when we go through the walkthrough. Now, the other thing that we do at VividCharts every day is help customers standardize and automate their reporting. If you've worked with us, or if you've seen our tool or seen any of our demos in the past, you would see how we do some of those things. But one thing that AI is going to help us do is work on those tasks even better. So we're going to help with standardization. We're going to help automate some more of the manual work. But what about the evaluation? So you have a report that comes out. How do we automate someone reading or something reading and giving feedback on that report to know if it meets our standards? We believe that AI is and will help us do that. And we have some examples of that. This last example is, I think, one of the promises of AI is we just extract away some of the complexity. So today, if you have to interact with a bunch of systems in order to get to the end state of your task, we do believe that AI is going to extract some of those systems, or at least your interaction with those systems directly, and decrease the complexity of these workflows. So today, as a person, if you're doing the reporting, your workflow may be 15 steps in order to go through the whole process. AI may not take away all 15 steps. Potentially it could, but more than likely it's going to start chipping away at different steps of that workflow and decrease the complexity for you as the end user. So those are some things that we believe pretty strongly, and we think that we know. What are some things that we believe? One thing is that the discussion that we're already having around AI is talking about the work being done. So, and the value of that work being done. Now, at VividCharts, we talk about this all the time because we know that the end output of the work that we help people automate is a report, some sort of document, some sort of report, some sort of dashboard that can be used for evaluation and discussion. So it's very clear that the work, the output, is that report, and that's where the value is, the actual production of that report. Today, in the ecosystem and enterprise software, that's not always the discussion. Sometimes it's about usage, sometimes it's about seats, things like that. But we do feel pretty strongly, and the discussion's already shifting over to the work that's actually being done. Again, at VividCharts, we've been talking about that for a long time. So it's nothing new if you're a customer of ours to have those discussions. A second one here that we believe is that the chat interface will not be the primary UX where the AI work is done. And we'll talk about these different interfaces, but I do think in November of 2022, the introduction of ChatGPT really sparked kind of the discussion of AI and the zeitgeist of AI in a way that we probably never imagined. And because of that, I think many people that I talk to outside of work, even customers, and I think just naturally people have this concept of chatting with AI tools as like the UX and the experience there. But as we start talking about agents and work being done, the chat interface, the chat UX maybe isn't always the best UX for that workflow. This last one, I have a different color because maybe it's an opinion or a belief we have that is less strongly held. So again, these are all beliefs. We think they're going to come true. We see them, the beginning steps of these things coming true. Maybe this last one we hold a little less strongly, and that's just the end user, the person that's at the very end of this work stream and workflow will be able to operate in environments that they feel most common. So today, a workflow may require you to work across multiple systems and multiple environments. And typically, we have comfort level with 1 or 2 or 3 of those environments, but maybe to do a workflow, there's, again, 15 environments you have to work across. We do think AI not only is decreasing the workflow, but also will allow that end user to live within environments that they feel comfortable with. So I've went through just a state of AI. I've went through some of the things that we believe and some of the things that we know currently. I'm going to stop just for a second, pause, and see if there's any questions coming in that maybe someone wants to ask before we move on to the next little segment. Okay, doesn't seem like anyone has anything yet, so let's keep moving forward. Let's go into this section that I'm calling Meet the Agents. Now, these, I give these guys different names, and we're going to be introduced when we go through the work streams and workflows into a bunch of other agents. But I just want to introduce you to 3 of the agents, because we're going to talk about some characteristics and some items around the agents that'll help ground the discussion that we have. So in this case, we have a research agent that has a task and a job that he's meant to do. And then even though this other agent looks the same, he has a very different task. And we have this agent called the time series summary agent. And then we have another agent that has a similar name, looks similar, but also has a different task. And we will talk about why these things are set up this way, but he's the time series highlights agent. So let's talk. So now that you've been introduced to 3 of the ones that we're going to go through, let's talk a little bit about what's special about these agents. So what are some of the elements of an agent? Like what are some, when we think of an agent, the terms used pretty frequently, happy to discuss some of that at some point, but I just want to go through some of the characteristics or elements of an agent. What are the things we have to have for an agent to do the work? We need instructions. And if you go back and think about this one, here's the research agent. A research agent is going to have a set of instructions that we provide it, that we help with it, receive, that is going to be specific to its task. So those instructions are specific to the research agent task. An agent's going to have triggers. It may be a very simple yes, no kind of answer, and do I act or do I not act? Or maybe more complicated, where the agent has a trigger based on a whole kind of decision tree type of thought and thinking. But every agent needs to know when to do work. For example, I know I need to go do work when my alarm goes off in the morning. And similarly, agents need to have some sort of trigger that says, you can go do your work now. Agents also need some sort of memory. So imagine if you were doing a task and every time you did a task, you forgot about it or you didn't have access to the work that you had already done. Agents need some sort of memory. Probably one of the most important aspects to the things that we'll be talking about are tools. Imagine the time series highlights agent, and we'll go through that here in a second, In order to do that task, let's say you had an intern come in and you're trying to train the intern to do the task of writing highlights for a time series chart. What are the things that you would have to give them in order to do that work? And those tools are the things we have to think about when it comes to looking at our agents. And last and definitely not least, but the knowledge and skills. And if you probably hear a lot of discussions and people talking about the different models that are out there and the different companies that have models and the uses they are. And so you can equate knowledge and skills with those models that we often talk about. So these are the things, let's say these are the characteristics and the input of what goes into an agent. But then we don't want to give all this stuff to an agent and then not get anything out of it. So what is the output of that? And then how do evaluations fit into this? The output is, if we're giving all these skills, all these tools, all these capabilities to the agent, we have very specific business processes that we want that agent to work on. We have tasks that need to be completed, potentially very specific tasks that need to be completed, and then work needs to be done. Now, once that work is done, we also need some sort of evaluation. And with that evaluation, that could be done by a human, that could be potentially done by an agent, another agent, and we'll look at some of those examples. Before I go on, I do have some questions coming in, but I will go ahead and finish up the agent section first for a second. So let's think back to those three agents we had. So these agents here, research agent, time series, summary agent, and time series highlights agent. The characteristics that make up the agent. What are some of those? How do we tease out some of those characteristics? One is that they have a very specific task to accomplish. Those tasks come with specific instruction sets. In the AI world, we might use the term prompts. The agent is required access to different tools, which we talked about. They're activated at different times for different reasons. So you don't have one agent that does everything. You have agents, again, with a specific task. And evaluation of the performance is directly related to the task. And evaluations are often done by the people best suited for doing those evaluations, which is another way to say just domain experts. So if you have a task for an agent to do, and the work needs to be evaluated, whether it passes or fails, the domain expert obviously is going to be probably the best person to engage for that evaluation. Okay, so that's a little section on who the agents are or what the agents are. We're going to talk about what the agents are not here in a second, but I'm going to look at this question really quick. Going back to the previous point, if the chat interface isn't the future to interact with AI, what is? Agents, but how do you see end users interacting with agents? Really good question, and I think the second part of that question was the answer to the question. If it's not a chat interface, if you're not sitting there just chatting with these AI tools to get work done, what is the interface going to be? I think we'll look at that through some of the examples we have, but it is the agent interface that is going to become more prolific, because what they will be able to do is do the work and then surface up through the UI some sort of interaction with the work that agent did. For example, a report may be generated and the evaluator agent may evaluate the report. And then I might interact with the actual report outcome of that evaluation, and then I can accept or reject it. And so I don't have to have a conversation. I actually have to just look at the evaluation and then essentially have some sort of UI, which we will look at, that says, yes, I like this report, or no, I don't. Good question. Okay, so we talked about what agents are, but what aren't agents? So if you're familiar with the Iron Man series, and I apologize if you're not, but I'm a pretty big Marvel fan. But if you're familiar with the Iron Man series, there's this character in there, Jarvis. And Jarvis is the super intelligent assistant that helps Iron Man, as depicted here. And Jarvis is this all-knowing support system as Tony Stark starts building all these different tools. Our agents are not that. Maybe someday we'll get to a place where we have Jarvis, but today our agents are not super intelligent. They're not all-knowing and all capable. Again, if we think back at what they are, very task specific. We give them jobs. We teach them how to do very specific jobs. And one other thing that they are not is our agents, our AI tools are not genies. And I sometimes think that people hear about the potential capabilities of AI solving all of our problems, doing all of our tasks, doing all of our work. And so the thought is, I should just be able to throw any random task at the agent and it should be successful. Just like a genie, I throw my wish at it and my wish should come true. But that is also not what our agents are. Again, very specific, very task specific, and they are instructed and trained to do those tasks. If you're not into Aladdin, maybe one of these other genies will be something that is more time era for you. Okay, so these are what agents are not. This is one reason why I think, for better or worse, I do think this is our experience with most of our experience interacting with these AI tools today. So we have these chat interfaces, and very much all of us who grew up in a Google world, you have this interface that says, ask any question, get any answer. And now with having these models on the back end of it, we get very intelligent answers. And it's pretty fun to interact with these tools because they give very good responses. And I feel like these chat interfaces and these chat tools, again, have just fed the idea that I should be able to just throw any question and then have good responses back. If you've played around with these tools, if you use these tools every day, all day, like many of us are starting to, you'll realize that sometimes you get answers back that aren't very good. And so this is potentially the difference between just having a chat response tool, OpenAI's ChatGPT or Grok, for example. The difference is we have very specific outcomes we need. If we're building a report, we need to collect the data. We need to have a very specific evaluation and report come out of that ask. And so we need to train these tools to act on those tasks. I'll pause for one more second because now that we've met the agents, or at least these three agents, I think we're going to go ahead and move into use case examples. I will pause one more second to see if we have any questions first. Okay, I'm going to go back here. Okay, so I got, let's see, I'm checking time, feel pretty good. The very first one I'm going to look at, if you were at Knowledge, we demoed this one there for people, but I do want to go through it again because it's something that we see quite a bit and get asked about quite a bit. But let's see if I can move this out of the way. Okay, so here's an example of just report quality. One of the things that in this example, I'm going to use a project status report, but one of the things that we have happen quite often is we have a standard report that we want to get out. But in order to get a standard report out, we need data to fit that standardization. And here's an example that we have where on the left-hand side, we have a project manager who put in a lot of content into their executive summary on their project status report and didn't really meet our guidelines. So they gave us a lot of information, but it's pretty hard to parse through because it's a lot to read and it doesn't really fit our expectations for that. And here's the exact opposite. So if we're trying to standardize our report and we have a project manager who puts this in, which is just a line basically saying, I did work this week. Again, there's not enough information to provide a standardized kind of expectation of that project status report. So the question is, how can we begin to use these tools to deal with both of these scenarios? And this is one example, and I'll show another example here in a second, but here's one example of what we can do. So just to give you a sense of how we're working, this is a knowledge base article. So it's some instructions. Remember, agents need instructions. So this knowledge base article has some guidelines for project managers to know, and then for our agents to read to say, when I get an executive summary in my project status report, it needs to have this key information, and these are our style guidelines that it needs to meet in order to pass approval. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to go back 1 second just so we can walk through this together. I'm going to pull up just the workflow and show you what this looks like if we're looking at the workflow from a holistic perspective. Okay, so we're looking at the summary agent here. Kind of zoom in. So in this case, again, we have an agent that's getting kicked off. So the trigger in this case would be we have a project status report that was completed by a project manager. That summary agent, SPM summary agent, has some tasks to do, which is evaluate and rewrite that executive summary so that we could go from the bad looking summary to a good looking summary. In this case, the tools that they need to collect the data, so they need to collect and review the executive summary. They need to go read the guidelines, which we just were looking at. And then they need to take all that information and then analyze it. Once they analyze it, they need to put their analysis and their new written summary out there. And in this case, we have some sort of approval evaluation process. In this case, we probably would have a human evaluate if the output was accepted, probably the project manager, and they would then approve it. And then once that's approved, we can then act upon it. So let's go back over and look at what the outcome of that would look like. Okay, so we have our bad, we have our information that our agent can use. Now the agent reads that information and puts out a new executive summary that fits not only the style, the guidelines, it has the content written in a way that we would expect in this report, for example. And just another example. Now, again, the data that feeds the agent is much less. So in this case, we're taking all the project information, all the project status report information, and the agent does the best job it can in order to rewrite that summary to meet our standards, which is very helpful. But I would say maybe in the human in the loop process, maybe we would say this is acceptable. Potentially this is not acceptable, which means we probably need the project manager to go fill out some more information. But again, it's just an example of how we can get to a standard output by having the agent help us along the way. So I'm going to stop there. See if there's any questions coming in. So I have a question. What's the biggest improvement over today's manual status reporting? What I would say, VividCharts helps the automation of those reports today. We work with a lot of customers automating the workflow around status reporting today. So that part we have covered. But the reports that get generated are only as good as the data that is available to those reports or the data that goes into the report. So you can imagine through that scenario that we just went through, this information that was reviewed allowed that report to get updated and standardized to a level that would have took a human before to go through that process of reading it, going back to the project manager and asking them to redo that. Okay, I'm going to go into the next one because the next one is actually another example of, here of status report. So we have examples of a good and bad full report. So I just did the executive summary one. let's go look at what a good report is and a bad report. And in this case, we're actually going to go and evaluate the whole report. And instead of rewrite, so what we just did is we rewrote that information. But in this case, we're going to show an example of putting a evaluated report out. And this is a real simple example. It's not necessarily good looking, but it's for a demonstration here. But we have a status report with all our key elements. And hopefully we can agree that this, if the content's correct, we can agree that this would be a decent status report. In this case, we can see that once we generated this report, the data was pretty sparse, missing data in this case. And so the question is, what do we do in this case in order to get a better report? Today, it would be manual, where someone would look at this and then have to go back, either add new data, most likely have to ask the project manager to go report and put new data in there. But someone would have to evaluate it and do that. So I'm going to show another kind of workflow here. It's a very similar workflow and pretty straightforward. Because in this case, we have the status evaluator agent or status report evaluator agent to review this information. They also have some guidelines and context for the whole report. And then they're also going to go evaluate that and then create a whole new report for that evaluation. And we'll see what that looks like. Let's take a look at I think what is going to be helpful is to look at what are the instructions. Again, every agent needs good instructions. I think what we can do is look at that criteria here. So what is the information that the agent is going to use in order to evaluate this? In this case, we have a pretty long, and I won't go through it all. This agent is getting trained and saying, hey, this is the expected format of information we have. This is all the information that should be on that report. And if we look, we can see that information on each of these reports. And under each area, we have the purpose of the area, we have quality criteria, and then we have examples. And not only examples, but we have the ability to score the input on that report to say if it's excellent or poor or somewhere in between. Now that evaluator agent can read this information, get the input from the data collection, and then do the analysis and put out a new report that says, does this report meet or fail our expectations? And so when we go back and look at what the output of these are, we'll look at the report in a PDF form here. So this one here is the evaluation. So this is the output the agent gave us after he evaluated that report. And so it said the executive summary was good. Here's some strengths. It even has some suggestions because it didn't get a 5 out of 5 based on our guidelines. It got a 4 out of 5, and it's saying you could get a 5 out of 5 if you did this. And it goes through each section and does the same evaluation. Now imagine how much work this would be if a person had to go through and manually evaluate this for every status report. And then it gives an overall score and says, here we have a health score of 3.7 out of 5, and it gave a summary of if it was an acceptable passing report or not. Now let's take a look at what the bad one is. Hopefully we agree that second example was pretty bad. The agent also agrees that based on the guidelines that we provide it and the instructions we give it, it was pretty poor. And it gives examples of how to improve it. And at the end, it even says you're missing data that was supposed to be on there. And at the end, it gives us an overall health score. Now, what could happen is ultimately the output we want at VividCharts is we want a report to be either, in this case, we're emailing this report to the project manager. But ultimately, we want a project status report to go out to the stakeholders. What could happen is in the case of the bad report, we could say we're not willing to let this report go out, and we won't trigger the creation of the project status report this week until this report meets our standards. And in this case, 1 out of 5, it wouldn't. However, in this case, at a 3 out of 3.7 out of 5. It does meet our standards. And so we could go ahead and create that project status report and send that out to our stakeholders through another step here. So that's another example. Now, again, we're using project status in both cases. In the first example, we rewrote information and added it to the report to better meet our standards. In the second one, we added some extra steps where we evaluated it. And based on that evaluation, we either went forward with creating the report or we stopped and said, go back and fix the report before we create the report. I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a second, see if they have any more questions coming in. So can you define the analysis triggers within specific items? Specifically, when reviewing large amounts of data, scanning a free-form text field for unique items or large volume of repetition. Scanning free-form text field. Yeah, I think so. What I would say is this brings up a really good perspective. So the question is, if we have lots of data, some is free-form text, some is not free-form, it's a large volume of information that's repeated, how can we trigger that? I will say in those cases, this is why we have split agents. So I think in your workflow or how things happen today, you would know that if it's content created through executive summary or project status reporting, we would send that agent to it. And I'll show you another example where we have non-content related information and how we sick other agents on it. The nice thing about agents is they do the tasks that they're trained for, and they somewhat can choose when they are being asked to do the work if you set your systems up as expected. Is this possible now? I will say everything you're seeing is stuff that I've created and fed through the agents that we've been working on to train. So like these outputs are fed through the evaluator agent that we've been working on using data that comes from our project status reports. And the next question, VividCharts will create these guidelines specific to an organization. Yeah, that's a really good point. So when we looked at how we evaluated these guidelines, one thing is for sure, at VividCharts, we know that every organization has their own standard expectations. We already do that through things like our visuals and elements like that. So in our systems, as you can see in the previous example, those guidelines were a knowledge-based article that we used to pull in, and we will continue. Today, that is the method we would use, is like each customer would be able to set up their own guidelines, and then those guidelines would be injected into kind of the agent's knowledge base in order to pull that into the activity that they're being asked to do. Now, there are many ways to think about how to pull that information into the knowledge base, or into the knowledge capabilities of the agent, but save that for another day. Are these agents trained on company internal data or external data? That's a great question. Right now, the agents, I would say the instruction set that we have today isn't necessarily training on external or internal data, but the instruction set is using VividCharts expertise in reporting. We help create the instruction set, the different prompts required to train or educate that agent on what needs to be the output. What I will say is being able to use systems pulling from other knowledge sets is going to be from internal knowledge sets that we would work with the customer on. And that is where a lot of the unique value is going to be, is, those sets of information at each organization to make sure that their standards are their standards and not coming from somewhere else. Okay, I want to get into this next example because personally I think it's the most exciting. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit and I'll keep answering questions as we go along here. Okay, so I'm going to pull this one up. Okay, so here's this is something that we do already at VividCharts very well. So It's a pretty simple example, but I think it will speak to how we think about this process of involving different AI agents through the process. But here's just a simple time series chart that shows incidents opened by week for the year of 2025 today. As I look at this, this is very pretty. It gives me some information, but I, as the end user, am starting to have to make decisions on what I'm looking at. And so what customers will often say is, this is great. It would be really nice if I also had some sort of summary. So give me the visual of the data that we're feeding it, but also can you give me a little bit of information and summarize maybe what I'm looking at? And the next step is I want to not only have the summary, but maybe can you pull out some key highlights or some key data points that I should pay attention to in this experience? And so maybe we need to add some bullet pointed highlights to this. And just take a step back and think about the work that's going to have to be done in order to create these pieces of information to feed this report. First of all, the chart's going to have to be created. VividCharts, we excel at this, getting the data, visualizing it, putting it on reports. Those are things that we excel at. Someone, in order to create a summary, someone or something is going to have to go and evaluate, read the information here, and then create some sort of written content based on that. They're also going to have to take that knowledge and that information and create the summary points. Once they have that knowledge, they've written that, they need to add it to this report. And then once it's on the report, maybe they want to email that information out also. So you can see all the work that is going to need to be done in order for this slide to be generated. So let's go back and look at this workflow a little bit. I'm excited about this workflow because we're starting to get into a little bit more of the truly kind of agentic concepts and power of putting multiple experiences together. So let's look at this first one. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to know that we need these evaluations done. So maybe the report is saved, or maybe it's a scheduled time of week or day or month. Whatever that trigger is, it says, okay, time series summary agent, who we met earlier. It says time series highlight agent, who we also met earlier. Please use the information, the knowledge, and the tools that we're giving you to go analyze that chart that we were looking at. It goes and collects the data, which again, VividCharts is very good at today. It has now that context. It processes and analyzes that information. So it has all the data, it knows it's a time series, knows what it's looking at, and then creates an analysis of it. And then it stores that information in some sort of memory system. And currently we'd store it in a record on a table in ServiceNow. And then it has that new information. So let's go back and look and see what that does. So now here's an example output. So we fed this chart, this information into our time series summary agent, and this is the output it gave. And then we fed that same information and told the highlights agent to go to work, and it came back with these highlights and gave us that information. This is great because now I create the chart or I generate the report. These agents now go do that work for me. It reads, creates the trends, the highlights, understands what's going on, and then puts it onto the report for us. This is great because we now just removed a bunch of effort, a bunch of steps of the workflow. But I think there's actually some more steps that make this pretty interesting. And so what is the next question that may be asked or is getting asked? And that's, what about our performance objectives? I'm looking at this chart. You gave me a summary of what happened, and maybe I can read this chart and get really good at reading charts, and I can get to that information myself. But do I know if we are meeting our expectations here? What are the performance objectives based on this? And so now we have another agent that we're introducing, and that's the time series specific to that type of data, evaluator agent. Now this evaluator agent is different than the other one we had, who was looking at project status reports. So in this case, They're looking at that, but they also need context. They need, and this goes to the question that was before, which is this internal or external information? Again, this is a very simple example, but in this case, we have a knowledge-based article that just lists out the KPIs for these reports. So in this case, it's weekly open incidents that are 30 or above. If we have a week with 30 or above open incidents, we consider that a failing week and we didn't meet our performance objectives. If it's 29 or less, we did. So we fed that information to our other agent. It went, analyzed that chart, and it said, okay, we reviewed 24 weeks. 22 of those 24 weeks we were passing, and 2 of those weeks we were failing. You can imagine this being in like an SLA environment and evaluating your SLAs in a similar fashion. I'm putting this down here because it's context for kind of the next step. So now just think of what we've created. We've created a deck that has, or an output report that has our time series information, our visual, a summary of that, which could potentially be also emailed to stakeholders. We have highlights, but we also now have an evaluation that uses our internal knowledge base as information to evaluate whether these KPIs are being met or not. But there's still, I think, one more question, and this is probably a key question in this whole conversation. And the question is, this is great to know. All this information is really great. But when you're in a meeting and you're looking at this information, what is the very next question that often gets asked? It's why? Why did we have 2 weeks that were failing our KPIs and our performance expectations? And so what would be the task? The task would be now me as the report creator to go find someone to help me research that, or potentially I would go do it myself, depending on how your organization's set up. But we want to know why on January 20th of 2025, that week, why was that week a week where we had 36 open incidents when we look at all these other weeks? And so the nice thing is we can get help with that. This is what these agents are going to be good at. And so if we look at this flow, we just went, and this is where some of the decision-making happens. So we just had the evaluator agent review that chart. It looked at our KPIs, and it basically said we had, potentially no research needed because we passed our KPI. And if we have no research needed, maybe we could just put the report in an email, or maybe we could add that information to the report. But in this case, we had some that were failing. We could instruct when to go do the research. That would be the trigger here. And once that research is needed, we can have the context and remember the query that we had. That research agent now has access to that query that says, okay, on that week we were failing, go get that information. And so let's go take a look at that here. So remember here we have, this is the records that are needed to be reviewed, because these are the queries needed to get the weeks that we failed. And in this case, what is the output of this? In this case, the output, after we go and review that information and do the research, is actually a new research report. And what does that look like? I'm going to go back here. So this creates a whole new report for us to look at. It's a research report. And the output looks like this. And we may, we could read this here, but I'm going to go and look. In some ways, we probably, with this type of document, we want to export it and give it to our stakeholders. So we'll go ahead and look at what the export of that looks like. Let's see. I don't have it there. Well, let's go back and look at the research report, and I'll zoom in a little bit. We'll make this full screen so we could look at it that way. So again, think of the work that's going to that would have had to been done in order for this report to be written. But in this case, we had an agent trained specifically to go get this information and generate this type of report. So we have an executive summary saying this is covering the weeks of January 20 to the 26th. We know that we had 36 tickets. Gives us some high level looking at it. Breaks down the tickets. 61% of the tickets that week were associated with our network. Gives us some just highlights on some themes associated with those tickets, connectivity issues, access errors. And it gives us some actionable highlights. It's talking about time of day that these tickets were coming in. Maybe we need to look at our capacity and our staffing around those times. So again, I think this one's pretty exciting because you can start to see the multi-level aspect of how these agents start to work together to evaluate, provide content, provide context, and add to our reports, and ultimately, in this case, get us to a research paper showing why those 36 tickets happened that week. Okay. That is the last example I have, and I know that we are running close on time. Again, I really appreciate people spending the time with us today. So I'm going to go look and look through the questions here. Can you show how you invoked / communicated with the agent? Yeah, I think that let's go back to maybe this example. We'll start with this simple example here. So again, every agent needs some sort of trigger. And I think that's what you're asking is like, how do we trigger this? In this case, we were doing a project status report in this example. And so the trigger here was a new project status report being created or saved. We know that we're coming upon our weekly chart generation and we need that status report created. Project manager goes in, creates that status report in ServiceNow. Once that's saved, that would be, in this case, the trigger. But I think some of these things are worth looking at internally at your organization, and then we can evaluate where different triggers are useful. Okay. Next question. But actually, let me expand on that just a second, just because I think this last example is a little bit more, I would say, agentic in its behavior. So we know that we have multiple triggers on this. So the trigger here was the creation of the report. We're saving the report with new data. It triggered the time series to go, both these two agents to go create the summaries and the highlights based on that new data or that new report. Once that was saved, that new saved summary or new saved highlight triggered the evaluation agent. So again, it's a little bit of a straightforward workflow in this case, but that evaluation agent did its work. And then here's where a decision is made. And again, the research agent is sitting there, and it is only triggered when there's a failing evaluation from the evaluation agent. And so you can see how there's not a hard yes or no, other than the agent saying one of our KPIs or performance metrics was not met. Let's see. And I do know that we're running really short on time. I'm going to answer this last question. Where do you see the biggest skills shift for reporting teams in the next 3 years? I think today with reporting teams, it's a lot of, again, disjointed work. It's a lot of manual work in order to get this done. I think as these tools become more prolific, I think being able to evaluate the work that the agents are putting out, being able to manage the different places these agents are being used, it's pretty commonplace to say you're going to become the manager of the work, not necessarily the doer of all the work. And I would even argue that one of the other questions was around prompts. One of the other skills will be helping train or provide the very specific instructions these agents need to do these tasks. We are at the top of the hour. I really do appreciate everyone who is here and stuck around for this hour. It's pretty exciting, and I'm happy that you gave me the time to share it with you. And again, if you would like, reach out to me or any of us at VividCharts at vividcharts.com. Again, my name is Gary Deach. I'm happy to talk to you at any time. And thank you again.